The airport buzzed with its usual chaos that Thursday morning. People rushed in all directions, dragging suitcases behind them like stubborn pets. Among the crowd was a woman in her mid-40s, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that swung with each hurried step. This was Susan Miller, marketing executive and frequent flyer, who prided herself on never missing a flight. But today was different. Today, everything seemed to be working against her. First, her alarm hadn't gone off. Then the taxi driver took the long route to the airport. And now the security line had been moving at the pace of cold honey dripping from a spoon. By the time Susan made it through, scanning the departure board with panicked eyes, she saw her flight was already boarding. Final call for Horizon Airlines Flight 372 to Chicago, the announcement echoed through the terminal. Susan broke into a run, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her carry-on bag bumping against her legs. She reached the gate just as the attendant was about to close the door. "Wait," she called out, waving her boarding pass. The young man at the counter gave her a look that mixed relief with annoyance. "You made it just in time, ma'am," he said, scanning her ticket. "They're finishing boarding now. You have a first-class seat, so you can go right on." Susan nodded, catching her breath. "Thank you." She walked down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar transition from terminal to aircraft. The cool air inside the plane hit her flushed face as she stepped aboard. The flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile. "Good morning, 2A is on your right." Susan moved into the first-class cabin, eyes fixed on finding her seat number. The overhead bins were already filling up, and passengers were settling in. She spotted her row, but someone was standing in the aisle right where she needed to be. A woman with dark skin and curly black hair styled in a neat bun was carefully arranging her laptop bag in the overhead compartment. She wore a crisp navy suit and simple pearl earrings. She wasn't moving quickly enough for Susan's frazzled nerves. Susan's patience, already worn thin by the morning's events, snapped like a dry twig. "Excuse me," she said, but it came out sharper than a simple request. When the woman didn't immediately move, Susan pushed forward, bumping into her with enough force to make the woman step back. "I said excuse me," Susan repeated, louder this time. "Some of us have seats to get to." The woman turned, her expression one of mild surprise rather than anger. "Of course," she said quietly, stepping back to make room. "My apologies." But Susan wasn't done. The stress of the morning, the fear of missing her flight, the relief that had turned to irritation, it all bubbled up and spilled over. "People need to be aware of their surroundings," she muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Especially in first class." The implication hung in the air, heavy and ugly. A few nearby passengers looked up, uncomfortable expressions crossing their faces. One elderly gentleman frowned deeply. The woman said nothing. She simply finished putting away her bag with deliberate movements, then took a seat by the window in the row across from Susan's. Susan stowed her own bag and settled into her seat, pulling out her phone to send a quick text before takeoff. As her fingers tapped the screen, she noticed they were trembling slightly. Deep down, a small voice was already telling her she'd crossed a line, but she pushed the thought away. The rest of the passengers filed in, the usual shuffle of economy boarding taking place behind the curtain. Susan kept her eyes on her phone, but she could feel stares. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight drinks. One of them, a friendly-looking woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, seemed especially attentive to the woman Susan had pushed. "Can I get you anything, Dr. Washington?" the attendant asked with genuine warmth. "Just water for now, Diane, thank you," the woman replied softly. "And maybe a coffee once we're in the air?" "Of course. We've got your favorite roast today." Susan glanced over, curious about the special treatment. The woman, Dr. Washington, caught her looking and gave a small, polite nod before turning to gaze out the window. The plane's engines rumbled to life. Susan buckled her seatbelt and leaned back, trying to relax. She had an important meeting in Chicago and she needed to focus. The incident was already fading from her mind. Little did she know it was about to come rushing back in the most unexpected way. The plane rumbled down the runway, gathering speed until it lifted smoothly into the air. Susan took a deep breath and pulled out her tablet to review her presentation one last time before landing. The morning's rush was finally behind her, and she could focus on the day ahead. A soft ding sounded, and the seatbelt sign turned off. Almost immediately, the cabin crew sprang into action, preparing the first-class service with practiced efficiency. Susan watched as Diane, the flight attendant she'd noticed earlier, brought Dr. Washington her promised coffee in an actual porcelain cup, not the plastic ones usually handed out. "Just how you like it," Diane said with a smile that seemed more genuine than professional. "Thank you, Diane. How's your son doing in college?" Dr. Washington asked, stirring her coffee slowly. Susan couldn't help but listen in. This wasn't the usual passenger crew small talk. They clearly knew each other well. The captain's voice suddenly came over the intercom, interrupting her thoughts. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Rodriguez speaking. I want to welcome you aboard Horizon Airlines Flight 372 to Chicago. We're expecting a smooth journey today with clear skies most of the way. Our flight time will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. Susan half listened, having heard similar announcements hundreds of times before. She was about to return to her tablet when the captain continued. "I'd like to extend a special welcome to someone joining us on board today. We're honored to have Dr. Elise Washington with us, the owner and CEO of Horizon Airlines. It's always a pleasure to have you flying with us, Dr. Washington." Susan's head snapped up so quickly she felt a twinge in her neck. Her eyes darted across the aisle to where Dr. Washington was giving a small, almost embarrassed wave to the flight attendants who were smiling at her. The owner of the airline, the woman she had rudely pushed and practically told didn't belong in first class, owned the entire airline. Susan felt her cheeks burn hot with embarrassment. A cold, sinking feeling settled in her stomach as the implications of her behavior began to dawn on her. Around her, other first-class passengers were turning in their seats, looking with new interest at Dr. Washington, who was trying to return to her coffee as if nothing had happened. A few were whispering to each other, and one businessman leaned over to introduce himself. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Washington. I'd followed your career for years. What you've done with Horizon is nothing short of remarkable." Dr. Washington thanked him graciously, shaking his hand before politely returning to her work. Susan noticed that despite the attention, there was no hint of arrogance in the woman's demeanor. She seemed genuinely humble. While pretending to look at her tablet, Susan quickly typed Dr. Elise Washington Horizon Airlines into a search engine. The results loaded instantly. There she was, the same woman sitting across from her, featured in Forbes magazine's Most Innovative CEOs list. The article headline read, "From Engineering Lab to CEO, How Elise Washington Revolutionized Air Travel." Susan read quickly, learning that Dr. Washington had started as an aerospace engineer, designed a new type of fuel-efficient engine, and instead of just selling the patent, had built her own airline from the ground up. Horizon was now known for having the most modern fleet in the industry and for its commitment to decreasing aviation's carbon footprint. And Susan had treated her like she didn't belong. The flight attendant stopped by Susan's seat, offering breakfast. "Would you like the omelette or the fruit plate this morning?" she asked pleasantly. "The fruit plate, please," Susan replied, her voice coming out small and tight. As the attendant moved on, Susan noticed Dr. Washington watching her. Their eyes met briefly before Susan looked away, unable to hold her gaze. She felt like everyone on the plane somehow knew what she had done, like they could all see right through her. For the remainder of the breakfast service, Susan ate mechanically, not tasting the food. Her mind was racing, replaying the encounter at the start of the flight over and over, each time feeling worse than before. She had 2 hours left on this flight. 2 hours sitting across from the woman she had insulted, who turned out to be not just any passenger, but the owner of the entire airline. The question now was, what, if anything, could she do to make it right? Susan stared out the window, watching clouds drift by as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. 20 minutes had passed since the captain's announcement, but her embarrassment hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, settling in her chest like a heavy stone. She glanced across the aisle again. Dr. Washington was typing on her laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. A document with charts and graphs filled the screen. Even from this distance, Susan could tell it was something complex, maybe a business report or a technical analysis. The woman was clearly brilliant, on top of being successful. Susan picked up her phone, then put it down again. She scrolled through her emails without reading them. Picked up a magazine, flipped through it, then closed it without seeing a single page. She couldn't focus. All she could think about was how she'd behaved. "Would you care for something to drink?" The flight attendant's voice startled her. "Just water, please," Susan said, her throat suddenly dry. As the attendant poured the water, Susan noticed her name tag, Diane, the same attendant who had been friendly with Dr. Washington. "Excuse me," Susan said quietly. "You seem to know Dr. Washington well." Diane smiled, handing over the glass. "Most of the crew does. She makes a point to learn everyone's names, from the pilots to the ground staff. Been that way since she started the company." "What's she like, as a boss?" Susan asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Diane glanced over at Dr. Washington, who was now looking at something on her phone. "Best I've ever had. Before Horizon, I worked for 2 other airlines. Never felt valued like I do here." She lowered her voice. "When my mother was sick last year, Dr. Washington made sure I got the time off I needed. Paid leave too. And she sent flowers to the hospital." Susan nodded, feeling even worse than before. "That's really nice. She changed the whole industry, you know, not just with the fuel-efficient planes. She made sure all employees get proper benefits, fair schedules. She even started a scholarship program for young people who want to work in aviation but can't afford the training." "I didn't know that," Susan said, taking a sip of her water. "Most people don't. She doesn't do it for the publicity." Diane smiled again and moved on to the next passenger. Susan sat with this new information, turning it over in her mind. The woman she had rudely shoved wasn't just rich or powerful, she was genuinely making a difference in people's lives. And Susan had treated her like she didn't belong. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing a slight shake. The seatbelt sign dinged on. From across the aisle, Susan heard a small gasp. She looked over to see Dr. Washington gripping her armrests tightly, her eyes closed. It took Susan a moment to realize what she was seeing. Dr. Washington was afraid of flying. The woman who owned an airline, who had designed airplane engines, was afraid of flying. The realization struck Susan as both surprising and somehow deeply human. There was something almost funny about it, but also touching. This accomplished woman had built an empire around something that frightened her. The turbulence settled after a minute, and Dr. Washington slowly released her grip on the armrests. She took a deep breath, then opened her eyes, and found Susan watching her. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Susan felt like she should look away, pretend she hadn't seen anything, but something held her gaze. There was a vulnerability in Dr. Washington's eyes that hadn't been there before. Dr. Washington gave a small, self-conscious smile. "Not what you'd expect from someone in my position, is it?" she said, her voice just loud enough to carry across the aisle. It was the first time she had directly addressed Susan since their encounter at the beginning of the flight. Susan hesitated, then shook her head. "I guess we all have our things," she replied awkwardly. "Indeed we do," Dr. Washington said. She seemed about to say something else when her phone buzzed. She glanced down at it, then back at Susan. "Excuse me, I need to take this." As Dr. Washington began a quiet conversation about some business matter, Susan felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. The moment had passed, but something had shifted. A tiny connection had formed, small but real. Susan buckled her seatbelt and leaned back in her seat. There was still more than an hour left in the flight, plenty of time to figure out what to do next. The flight continued smoothly after the brief patch of turbulence. Susan pretended to work on her presentation, but her mind kept wandering. Every few minutes, she would glance across the aisle at Dr. Washington, who had returned to her laptop after finishing her phone call. 45 minutes to landing, folks, the captain announced over the intercom. Weather in Chicago is clear and a pleasant 68 degrees. Susan took a deep breath. Time was running out. If she was going to say something to Dr. Washington, it needed to be soon. The thought of just letting it go crossed her mind. They would land, go their separate ways, and never see each other again. But something about that felt wrong, like leaving a door open during a storm. She unfastened her seatbelt and stood up before she could change her mind. Her legs felt strangely unsteady as she took the single step across the aisle. Dr. Washington looked up from her laptop, her expression curious but guarded. "Excuse me, Dr. Washington," Susan said, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Dr. Washington closed her laptop. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Susan sat down, suddenly unsure where to begin. Up close, she noticed that Dr. Washington had kind eyes, though they were watchful now. "I wanted to apologize," Susan finally said, "for earlier when we were boarding. I was rude to you, and there's no excuse for that." Dr. Washington studied her for a moment. "Thank you for saying that. It couldn't have been easy to come over here." "It wasn't," Susan admitted with a nervous laugh, "but it was the right thing to do. And then when I found out who you are," she trailed off, embarrassed. "Would you have apologized if I wasn't the owner of the airline?" Dr. Washington asked. There was no accusation in her tone, just genuine curiosity. The question caught Susan off guard. She opened her mouth to automatically say yes, then closed it. The honest answer wasn't that simple. "I don't know," she said finally. "I'd like to think I would have, but I'm not sure. And that bothers me." Dr. Washington nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. "At least you're thinking about it now." "Can I ask you something?" Susan said. When Dr. Washington nodded, she continued, "Why didn't you say anything when I pushed past you? You could have put me in my place right then." "What would that have accomplished?" Dr. Washington replied. "Would it have changed your mind about anything, or would it have just made you defensive?" Susan thought about it. "Probably defensive," she admitted. "Exactly. Look, I've been dealing with moments like that my whole life. When I was younger, I got angry every time. I'd fight back, call people out. It was exhausting." "I can imagine," Susan said, though truthfully, she couldn't really imagine at all. "No, you can't," Dr. Washington said, "but without heat. And that's okay. You don't need to fully understand someone's experience to treat them with respect." A flight attendant passed by, giving them a curious look but continuing on her way. "You know what's funny?" Dr. Washington continued. "I was running late this morning too. My driver hit traffic and I barely made it to the gate. I was stressed out, just like you probably were. Yet you didn't take it out on anyone," Susan pointed out. Dr. Washington shrugged. "I've had more practice managing stress, I guess, and more incentive to stay composed in public. Because people are watching you." "Because people are always watching me," Dr. Washington corrected. "When you're a black woman in a position like mine, everything you do is scrutinized. If I had acted the way you did, it wouldn't be seen as just having a bad day." Susan felt her face grow warm again. "I never thought about it that way." "Most people don't have to," Dr. Washington said. She glanced out the window. "Looks like we're starting our descent." As if on cue, the seatbelt sign dinged on. Susan stood up to return to her seat. "Thank you," she said, "for listening, and for being so gracious about it all." Dr. Washington smiled. "Thanks for coming over. It took courage." She extended her hand. "I'm Elise, by the way." Susan took her hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Susan Miller. It's nice to meet you, Elise. Properly this time." The plane touched down with a slight bump, then rolled smoothly along the runway. Elise let out a small sigh of relief, her grip on the armrest finally relaxing. "We made it," Susan said with a smile. "Always a good feeling," Elise agreed. "No matter how many flights I take, there's always that moment of, thank goodness." The plane taxied toward the gate, slowing as it approached the terminal. Around them, other passengers began gathering their belongings, switching on phones, preparing to disembark. "So what brings you to Chicago?" Elise asked, seeming in no hurry to end their conversation. "Big client meeting," Susan explained. "I work in marketing. We're pitching a campaign to a tech company headquartered here." Nervous? Susan considered the question. An hour ago, she would have said yes. The presentation, the client's reputation for being hard to please, the pressure from her boss to land this account, it had all been weighing on her. But somehow, after everything that had happened on the flight, the meeting didn't seem quite so intimidating anymore. "Not as much as I was this morning," she admitted. "Puts things in perspective, I guess." Elise nodded understandingly. "I'm speaking at a conference on sustainable aviation. Ironic, right? The nervous flyer giving a talk about the future of flying." I think it makes your perspective more valuable, actually, Susan said. Like you said earlier, you don't take safety for granted. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately stood up, reaching for the overhead bins, eager to exit. I should get back to my seat for my things, Elise said, unbuckling her seatbelt. But before she could stand, the flight attendant, Diane, approached them. Dr. Washington, she said, your car is waiting at the VIP exit. Would you like me to help with your bag? I've got it, thanks, Diane. Elise stood up, then turned to Susan. It was nice talking with you, Susan. Good luck with your meeting. Thank you, Susan replied, feeling a strange disappointment that their time together was ending. And good luck with your speech, though I'm sure you don't need it. Elise smiled and returned to her seat to collect her laptop bag. Susan gathered her own things, joining the line of passengers waiting to exit. She watched as Diane escorted Elise toward the front of the plane, where she would likely be first off and whisked away to whatever VIP treatment awaited her. It made sense, of course. Someone like Elise Washington, brilliant engineer, airline owner, keynote speaker, would have a different airport experience than regular passengers. Their worlds would naturally separate once they left the plane. Susan shuffled forward with the line, already thinking about finding a taxi, checking into her hotel, reviewing her notes one more time before tomorrow's meeting. Back to normal life. She was nearly to the exit when she heard her name. Susan, hold on a moment. She turned to see Elise standing by the cockpit door, gesturing for her to come over. Confused but curious, Susan stepped out of line. Everything okay? She asked when she reached Elise. I had a thought, Elise said. Your meeting tomorrow, is it with Horizon Tech by any chance? Susan's eyes widened in surprise. How did you know that? Elise smiled. Lucky guess. They're one of the few tech companies headquartered here who might be looking for a marketing campaign right now. I know the CEO, Dave Chen. We serve on a climate initiative board together. You know Dave? Susan couldn't hide her astonishment. Dave Chen was practically a legend in the tech world. I do, and I'm having dinner with him tonight, actually. The conference center is right next to Horizon's headquarters. Elise seemed to hesitate for a moment, then continued, would you want to join us? It might give you a chance to meet him in a more casual setting before your pitch tomorrow. Susan stared at her, speechless. Was Elise Washington, the woman she had rudely shoved just hours ago, now offering to introduce her to the CEO she was supposed to impress tomorrow? That's incredibly generous, she finally managed. But why would you do that for me? Elise considered her question thoughtfully. Let's just say I believe in second chances, and I have a feeling you're going to take this one seriously. Around them, the last passengers were exiting the plane. The flight crew waited patiently at the door. So, Elise prompted, dinner tonight? 7 o'clock at the Grant Hotel? Susan took a deep breath. Yes, thank you. I'd be honored. Great, Elise said with a warm smile. I'll tell my assistant to add your name to the reservation. She handed Susan a business card. Text me when you arrive. As they walked together toward the exit, Susan felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, and something like hope. The day had started with such thoughtless rudeness on her part, and now here she was, walking side by side with the woman she had wronged, who was somehow offering her an incredible opportunity instead of holding a grudge. You know, Susan said as they reached the jet bridge, I think this might be the most educational flight I've ever taken. Elise laughed. For me too, she said. See you tonight, Susan. 6 months later, Susan stood in the lobby of a downtown hotel, adjusting her blazer nervously. She checked her watch again, still 15 minutes early. Taking a deep breath, she walked to the conference room where today's workshop would be held. A sign outside the door read, Understanding Unconscious Bias in the Workplace, presented by Horizon Foundation. Susan peeked through the glass doors. The room was nearly empty, just a few hotel staff arranging chairs and setting up a podium at the front. Perfect timing. She slipped inside and chose a seat near the middle, not too close to the front, but not hiding in the back either. As she arranged her notebook and pen, memories of that flight 6 months ago flooded back. The dinner that evening with Elise and Dave had gone better than she could have hoped. Dave was impressed by her candor when she admitted she'd been rude to Elise on the plane, an admission Elise hadn't forced her to make but Susan felt was necessary. Honesty and self-awareness, Dave had said, nodding appreciatively. Two qualities we value at Horizon Tech. Her marketing team got the contract. And more impressively, they'd kept it, delivering a campaign that boosted Horizon Tech's profile significantly. Susan had been promoted to senior account manager as a result. But that professional success wasn't why she was here today. This workshop wasn't mandatory for her job. She'd signed up voluntarily, wanting to better understand the unconscious biases that had led to her behavior on that flight. The room gradually filled with people, mostly professionals in business attire, some chatting quietly, others scrolling through phones. At exactly 9 o'clock, the side door opened and Elise Washington walked in. She looked just as Susan remembered, confident, elegant, with that same warm smile. She was wearing a simple blue dress with a blazer, her curly hair styled in a neat bun. Susan felt a flutter of nervous excitement as Elise scanned the room and their eyes met. Elise's smile widened with recognition. She gave Susan a small wave before turning her attention to setting up her presentation. "Good morning, everyone," Elise began once the room had quieted. "Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. I'm Dr. Elise Washington, and yes, I'm the person who owns that airline with the blue planes." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. "But today, I'm not here to talk about aviation. I'm here to talk about something that affects all of us, regardless of our industry, unconscious bias." As Elise spoke, Susan found herself just as captivated as she had been during their conversation on the plane. Elise had a way of discussing difficult topics without making people feel attacked or defensive. She shared personal stories, including some painful ones, with grace and even occasional humor. "The goal isn't to make you feel guilty," Elise explained. "Guilt doesn't help anyone grow. The goal is awareness, because once we're aware of our biases, we can choose different actions." During the group discussion portion, Susan shared her own story, without naming Elise directly, about making assumptions about someone on a plane based on appearance, only to later discover how wrong those assumptions were. "That moment changed how I see the world," she admitted to her small group. "It made me question what other assumptions I might be making without realizing it." After the workshop ended, most participants filed out quickly, heading back to offices or other commitments. Susan lingered, waiting until Elise had finished speaking with the last few attendees who had approached her with questions. "Susan," Elise said warmly, walking over to her, "I was so happy to see you here today." "I wouldn't have missed it," Susan replied. "Your foundation is doing important work." "We're trying," Elise said, "one workshop at a time." "How long are you in town?" Susan asked. "Just until tomorrow. I have meetings with potential corporate sponsors this afternoon." Susan nodded, then gathered her courage. "I was wondering if you might have time for coffee. There's something I wanted to ask you about." "Sure," Elise said, checking her watch. "I have about an hour before my next meeting." As they walked together toward the hotel cafe, Susan explained her idea. A program at her company to help market and promote businesses owned by women and minorities, offering reduced rates and specialized services. "I'd love your input," Susan said as they found a table. "If it's something you think would actually be helpful, not just look good on paper." Elise listened thoughtfully, asking insightful questions and offering suggestions. By the time they finished their coffee, they had sketched out a basic framework for the program. "You know," Elise said as they prepared to part ways, "when you bumped into me that day on the plane, I never would have imagined we'd end up here." Susan laughed. "Me neither. Funny how life works sometimes." "It's not just luck, though," Elise said more seriously. "It's what we choose to do with our mistakes that matters." They exchanged a warm handshake that felt like so much more. An acknowledgement of how far they'd both come since that chance encounter at 30,000 feet.